Ghana has joined other world leaders in condemning the US attack on Venezuela, calling it an unauthorized invasion. In a statement posted to the X account of Ghana's Foreign Minister Okudzeto Ablakwa, the government of Ghana said colonial ambition should have no place in the post-World War II era. And the mention of World War II is a direct response to President Trump invoking the Monroe Doctrine in his post-attack press conference. On my channel, Do or Da, I'm breaking down what all of this mean today. All right, so subscribe to my YouTube channel if you're interested in more intellectual conversations like this. My name is Senebi Tony. All right, I'm a Ghanaian writer who lives in the US. Now, if you've been living under a rock, on January 3rd, 2026, the US went into Venezuela, dropped some bombs like it was a movie, captured the president of Venezuela, Maduro, and his wife, put them on a warship, and brought them to New York to face charges related to narco-terrorism. US invaded the airspace of a sovereign country and then intercepted their political structure and again invaded even other aspects of international law with this attack. And this is what the government of Ghana was calling out in the statement they put out condemning the attack. Let me read two paragraphs from the statement, and then I'll use those paragraphs to explain what the government of Ghana is trying to say to y'all. In paragraph 2, the government of Ghana said, Ghana expresses strong reservation against the unitary use of force and strongly deploys such acts that violate the Charter of the United Nations and international law, as well as the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states. Paragraph 5 also states, these declarations are reminiscent of the colonial and imperialist era. They set a dangerous precedent for the global order. Such colonial ambition should have no place in the post-World War II era. Now, the second paragraph I read, the government of Ghana talked about the use of force and the sovereignty of states. Those two things are direct words that come from the UN Charter. So, the United Nations was founded in 1945. Last year was 80 years since the founding of the United Nations. And the United Nations was founded because World War II really devastated the whole world. The world's economy, the way of life of people, and everything was drastically affected by World War II. So all the leaders of the world at the time decided that we need to come together to set some ground rules to prevent a war like this happening in future. That is one of the impulses for the founding of the United Nations. So the United Nations Charter, the UN Charter, have provisions in it to ensure that world peace remains. For example, Article 2 talks about the sovereignty of state. Every single country on earth have sovereignty. What that means is that they get to decide their political present and future. No country can tell another country what their political system should be. They get to decide their territorial integrity. So territorial integrity means that you get to protect your land, your air, and your water. So the sea in front of Venezuela constitutes the territorial integrity of Venezuela. The air of Venezuela constitutes the territorial integrity of Venezuela, and the land. So by Trump going into Venezuela or leading an attack on Venezuela through their sea, air, and land is a violation of Venezuela's territorial integrity under this thing, right? And 2, Ghana also talked about the use of force. Under the UN Charter, countries are not allowed to use force to attack another country. That is why if countries normally have issues with other countries, they put economic sanctions on those countries. Because the use of force, weapons, is forbidden under international law. The only reason you can use force is in self-defense. So if one country attacks you, then you can use force to defend yourself. I'll give you a practical example. So when 9/11 happened, this year will be 25 years since 9/11 attack on the US. The United Nations Security Council put out a declaration that 9/11 attack is an attack on the US sovereignty. So the US can use force in self-defense. That is the legal basis for the war on terror. So the US war on terror has legal basis because the US was attacked first. You understand that? But there's something that is also interesting about that. The war in Iraq, which the US embarked on in 2003, the US Secretary of State, Colin Powell, went before the UN to try to stretch the meaning of self-defense to include, Iraq. What the government of the US was saying at the time was that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. But under the use of force doctrine of international law, there is something called preemptive attack. And preemptive attacks are not allowed. Where you feel like somebody is about to attack you, so you attack them first, that is a no-no under international law. So the United Nations did not sanction the US attack on Iraq, and the US still went ahead and did it. So that is a violation of international law. That is why anytime you are hearing the US violating international law on Iraq, nobody really brings up Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was sanctioned by the UN. Iraq was not. Even the then Secretary of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, put out a statement to say that the US attack on Iraq was unlawful in 2004. Right? Good. So this is the issue of the second paragraph of the president or the government of Ghana's statement, that what the US did is a direct violation of international rules and norms. Right? Do we agree that what the president of Ghana is saying makes sense under international law rules? Yes, because there are other countries, including Mexico, South Africa, Brazil, who have come out to condemn what the US have done. There are two countries who have actually supported the US. France and the UK have actually supported US attack on Venezuela. Why? Because yesterday, after the US attacked Venezuela, France and the UK went into Syria to attack Syria in the name of fighting ISIS. So, Trump and the US set the precedent in Venezuela, and immediately France and the UK follow suit in Syria, which is why the government of Ghana is saying that this is a dangerous precedent. Because what the US is saying is that you can do anything you want under international law and nobody can check you. This is what it looks like. And now, the fifth paragraph, the part about imperialist ambitions that I brought up, that is the part that I believe is a direct response to Trump's press conference afterwards. So if you watch the press conference President Trump did after the Venezuela attack, Trump talked about the fact that US have Monroe Doctrine, and he even called it Monroe Doctrine. What is the Monroe Doctrine? In 1823, I am bad at mentioning numbers because I'm dyslexic. So pardon me when I'm mentioning number and I fumble, all right? So in 1823, the US president at the time, President Monroe, declared that the Western Hemisphere of the earth is the sovereign of the US, or is under the guidance of the US, or the US have protection over the Western Hemisphere. So, in case you didn't know, Africa was not the only part of the world that was colonized. The North, South, and Central America were also colonized by Europeans. And in the 1800s, the Latin countries in South America started gaining independence against the Europeans. And so the Europeans wanted to use force to force these Latin America countries to allow the Europeans to still hold dominion over them. And the US president at the time was like, no, 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 no. This part of the earth is ours now. We are the new boss in charge now. Leave Latin America for us to take care of, and then in turn, we will also not attack your sphere of influence. That's the legal term. That's what they used at the time, sphere of influence. So the sphere of influence of Europe was the entire Europe and even to an extent Asia and Africa, to an extent. I said to an extent because you know that in reality, nobody really had dominion over those places, even though we had colonialism. And so the Monroe Doctrine was implemented in 1823, and that has been US government policy. That this part of the world, it is ours to control. So we police it, we do everything we want over there, right? Good. And so when the UN Charter was passed, you realize that the UN Charter says that countries have sovereignty. So the Monroe Doctrine is no longer in effect over here because the Latin America countries now have sovereignty to govern themselves. So the US don't have to protect them anymore. They can protect themselves. You understand that? That is the meaning of the statement. That is why the president of Ghana or the government of Ghana brought up World War II. Because after World War II, the global order was restructured. And the global order was restructured to mean that every country, no matter how big or small they are, have sovereignty. So the US and China have the same level of sovereignty as Togo and Benin, who are small countries. That is what legally on paper the law is, how it has been since the UN Charter. And so the Monroe Doctrine is an old law that is no longer powerful, but Trump invoked it. That is why the president of Ghana's or the government of Ghana's response has those words. Because what the government of Ghana is saying that in the colonial days, yes, you can say this place is your sphere of influence, but now no longer that way. And now, to even make it even more potent, I will say something that we all know as part of the Monroe Doctrine, and then I explain to you why it is no longer in effect. When the UN Charter was put in place, the US no longer had sovereignty over the countries in Latin America. So the US started doing something called covert operations. What they were doing was that instead of going into another country to attack them, which is now forbidden international law, what they did was that they worked with people within those countries to undermine the government of those countries. So you know that in Ghana we had President Nkrumah, and the CIA worked with military people in Ghana to overthrow Nkrumah. The CIA couldn't come to Ghana themselves to overthrow Nkrumah because Ghana has sovereignty. So they have to work with people within Ghana to do that, right? So that came to be known as covert operations. So the covert operation that the US was doing in Latin America specifically was still an expression of the Monroe Doctrine. And in 1986, the International Court of Justice said the covert operation that the US is doing is also forbidden under international law. So the US using their forces to back people to undermine countries is undermining the sovereignty of those countries. There is a case called Nicaragua versus United States. So Nicaragua is a country, and the government of the Nicaragua had a problem with the US because according to the US, the Nicaragua was backing El Salvador rebels. And so the US wanted to take out the government of Nicaragua. So the US started arming Contras or rebels in Nicaragua to fight against the government of Nicaragua. So Nicaragua took the matter to International Court of Justice. At that point, the US was under the International Court of Justice compulsory jurisdiction. Compulsory jurisdiction means that whenever somebody brings a case against you in the International Court of Justice, the court will hear it. You can't say no to the court. And when Nicaragua brought a case against the US was like, we are leaving the International Court of Justice compulsory jurisdiction. So the US left the International Court of Justice compulsory jurisdiction aspect in 1986, but the court still heard the case. The fact that you have said that you won't come to court doesn't mean that we cannot hear your case. That is for you, those of you who want to run away from court. If somebody sues you, you have to go. And so the ruling that came out under the ICJ was that the covert operation is still a form of use of force. So the US cannot do that anymore. And that is the case that established what are the rules of sovereignty for states. You understand that? And what are the rules of use of force and all that? All those things were captured under the Nicaragua, case. And US is technically no longer under the International Court of Justice because they removed themselves, even though there are some provisions of the International Court of Justice that still applies to the US. And you know the US is currently not under the International Criminal Court because they chose not to be part of it. But the ruling of the court on the Nicaragua case still applies to the US because the US was under it when it was passed. So the Monroe Doctrine reasoning violates this case. So by the written law, the UN Charter, the US is violating that. By the Nicaragua case, the US is violating that. And that is what the government of Ghana is saying. All right? That is basically the explanation of the statement from the government of Ghana that I felt like I should provide for viewers. If there are any questions about anything I said that you want to know more about, you can leave comments and then I will read them and get back to you. All right. Thank you for watching and subscribe to my channel. This year, like I said, we are going to talk a lot about international cases that happen outside of Africa that still affects us because everything affects us. You know, the attack on Venezuela, like I said, implicated an attack in Syria, which means that it could implicate an attack in West Africa. But we'll talk about all of that in future. Subscribe